Good evening, sweet viewer, and a warm welcome. Wherever you are in the world, whatever the hour on your clock, please find a quiet moment. Settle in. The world outside, with its simple answers and hurried pace, can wait. We are about to journey back, not to witness a single, clean event, but to stand at the bedside of a dying giant and watch the slow, agonizing process of its dissolution. Perhaps leave a note of the time and place you are listening from. A small anchor in our modern world, before we let go and drift into the deep, turbulent waters of the past. The fall of Rome. The phrase itself conjures a powerful image, a great marble colossus crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust. We are given a date, 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was unceremoniously deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. We mark it in our timelines as a neat, sharp line. Before this line, antiquity; after it, the Dark Ages. But the truth is never so simple. The fall of Rome was not a singular event. It was not a sudden death. It was a transformation, a long, painful, and complex unraveling that began centuries before the last emperor was sent into retirement. It was a systemic failure, a slow-motion collapse where the political, military, economic, and even spiritual foundations of the world's greatest empire rotted from within, long before the final walls were breached from without. To find the true beginning of the end, we must look not to the 5th century, but to the 3rd, to a period of such profound chaos and violence that it shattered the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was the fever that broke the back of the classical world. To understand the sheer trauma of this crisis, we must first appreciate the world it shattered, the world of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For nearly 200 years, from the accession of Augustus in 27 BC to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, the Roman Empire had presided over an unprecedented era of stability, prosperity, and order. From the misty shores of Britain to the scorching sands of Mesopotamia, from the dense forests of Germania to the fertile banks of the Nile, a single power ruled. A single legal system, a single currency, and a network of magnificent roads united tens of millions of people in a shared civilization. An aspiring merchant could travel from Spain to Syria, using the same coins, sleeping in similar inns, and finding protection under the same laws, all beneath the watchful gaze of the Roman eagle. The legions, masters of the world, were garrisoned on the far-flung frontiers, holding the borders secure. Inside this vast, protected space, cities flourished, philosophy and literature thrived, and for the provincial elite, life was predictable and good. There were, of course, wars on the frontiers and the occasional mad or tyrannical emperor, but the system itself felt eternal, unshakable. The poet Virgil had promised an imperium sine fine, an empire without end, and for generations it seemed he was right. The death of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD is often seen as the symbolic end of this golden age. His disastrous son, Commodus, whose reign was marked by megalomania and neglect, was assassinated in 192, plunging the empire into a brief but vicious civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors. The victor, a ruthless North African general named Septimius Severus, established a new dynasty. Severus understood the new reality of Roman power. On his deathbed, he is said to have given his sons a piece of brutally cynical advice: enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else. He had recognized that the true source of imperial authority no longer lay with the Senate in Rome or the consent of the people, but with the raw, coercive power of the legions. He dramatically increased army pay and benefits, a decision that would have catastrophic long-term consequences. For a time, the Severan dynasty maintained a fragile, militarized stability, but the precedent had been set. The army was now the ultimate arbiter of power, and the fate of the empire rested not on law or tradition, but on the loyalty of its soldiers. The breaking point came in the year 235 AD. The emperor of the time was Severus Alexander, a gentle and well-meaning young man dominated by his mother. While campaigning against the Germanic tribes on the Rhine frontier, he attempted to negotiate with the enemy, offering to pay them subsidies to keep the peace. To the hardened legionaries who revered martial glory and victory in battle, this was an act of unforgivable cowardice. They felt cheated of their bonuses and their honor. Led by a giant, brutish Thracian officer named Maximinus Thrax, the troops mutinied. They murdered the young emperor and his mother in their tent and proclaimed Maximinus, a man who was reportedly a common soldier who had risen through the ranks purely on merit and ferocity, as the new Augustus. This was a revolution. Maximinus was the first of the so-called barracks emperors. He was a non-senator, a provincial, a man of the army through and through. His accession marked the moment the Severan principle was made absolute. The army no longer just served the emperor, it created him. The floodgates of anarchy were thrown open. What followed was 50 years of almost uninterrupted chaos. The period from 235 to 284 AD saw more than 20 legitimate emperors, and an even greater number of usurpers and claimants rise and fall. The average reign was barely 2 years long. Almost all of them met a violent end, either killed in battle against a rival claimant, assassinated by their own disillusioned troops, or murdered by a palace conspiracy. The very concept of a stable succession collapsed. An emperor's greatest threat was no longer a foreign king or a senatorial plot, but the ambitious general of the legion in the next province. The cycle was as predictable as it was deadly. A successful general on the Danube or the Euphrates would win a major victory. His adoring troops, eager for a massive cash bonus or donativum, would hoist him on their shields and proclaim him emperor. He would then be forced to march on Rome, or wherever the current emperor was, initiating a devastating civil war. The legions, which were supposed to be defending the frontiers from external threats, were instead turned inward, slaughtering each other on the fields of Italy and Gaul. If the usurper won, he would rule only until his own troops became dissatisfied, or until another general in another province decided it was his turn to try for the purple. The list of names reads like a fever dream of ambition and bloodshed. After Maximinus Thrax, who was himself killed by his own soldiers during a siege, came the year of the 6 emperors in 238 AD. Gordian Way and Gordian Thau, a father-son duo in Africa, lasted just 21 days. Pupienus and Balbinus, 2 senators chosen to rule jointly, were murdered by the Praetorian Guard after only 3 months. The cycle ground on. Philip the Arab, who celebrated Rome's 1000th anniversary in 248 with spectacular games, was killed in battle by his successor, Decius. Decius, a staunch traditionalist who launched the first empire-wide persecution of Christians, was then killed in battle against the Goths, the first Roman emperor to die at the hands of a foreign enemy. His successor, Gallus, was murdered by his own men. Aemilianus lasted 3 months before he too was assassinated. The great prize of ruling the world had become a death sentence. Perhaps no story better illustrates the personal horror and imperial humiliation of this era than that of the Emperor Valerian. Ruling from 253, Valerian faced the trifecta of crises that defined the age: civil war, plague, and massive foreign invasions. He split the empire's administration with his son, Gallienus, taking the troubled east for himself while Gallienus managed the west. In the east, Valerian confronted the Sassanid Persian Empire, a new, aggressive, and highly organized dynasty that had replaced the more docile Parthians. The Sassanid king, Shapur I, was a brilliant and ruthless commander who saw the internal chaos of Rome as a golden opportunity. In 260 AD, near the city of Edessa in modern-day Turkey, the Roman and Persian armies met. The Roman army, likely weakened by the ongoing plague, was decisively defeated. And then the unthinkable happened. The Roman emperor, the Augustus, the living embodiment of the majesty of Rome, was captured alive by the enemy. Valerian, an old man in his 60s, became Shapur's prisoner. The humiliation was total and profound. Sassanid rock carvings, still visible today in Iran, depict the triumphant Shapur on horseback, with the defeated Valerian kneeling before him, begging for mercy. Roman sources claim that Shapur used the captured emperor as a human footstool, forcing him to kneel every time the Persian king mounted his horse. After Valerian died in captivity, Shapur allegedly had his skin flayed, tanned, dyed crimson and stuffed with straw to be displayed as a trophy in a Persian temple, a perpetual monument to Rome's impotence. The psychological shockwave of this event rippled across the empire. If the emperor himself was not safe, then who was? The gods had truly abandoned Rome. While the Roman legions were busy making and unmaking emperors and fighting each other in endless civil wars, the frontiers, left undefended, began to collapse. The external pressures that had been building for generations exploded with new force. On the northern frontier, along the vast forested lengths of the Rhine and Danube rivers, new and larger confederations of Germanic tribes, drawn by the wealth of the empire and pushed from behind by migrations in their own lands, saw their chance. The Franks and the Alemanni poured across the Rhine, raiding deep into the heart of Gaul, sacking cities, and even launching raids into Spain and northern Italy. The Goths, a formidable people who had migrated to the Black Sea coast, built fleets of ships and launched devastating piratical raids across the Aegean Sea. They sacked cities in Greece and Asia Minor that had not seen a foreign invader for centuries, including the ancient city of Athens. For the first time in hundreds of years, the Roman heartland was no longer safe. The Pax Romana was a distant memory. The situation in the east was, if anything, even worse. The capture of Valerian by the Sassanids created a massive power vacuum. The Persians rampaged through Syria, sacking the great city of Antioch and carrying off tens of thousands of its citizens into slavery. The central Roman government, consumed by its own internal conflicts, was powerless to respond effectively. The empire was bleeding from every pore, and the constant civil wars acted as an anticoagulant, ensuring the wounds could never heal. This relentless political and military chaos fueled an equally devastating economic collapse. The sophisticated, monetized market economy of the early empire simply could not withstand the strain. The root of the problem was the emperor's desperate need for money. The loyalty of the army had to be bought, and civil wars were ruinously expensive. With trade disrupted and agricultural production plummeting due to constant warfare, the tax base evaporated. Unable to raise funds through legitimate taxation, the emperors turned to the only tool they had, the debasement of the currency. The workhorse of the Roman economy was the denarius, a small silver coin. Under the emperors of the 1st and 2nd centuries, it was a coin of high-purity silver. But the barracks emperors, desperate to mint more coins to pay more soldiers, began to systematically reduce the amount of silver in each coin, replacing it with cheaper base metals like copper and bronze. The process accelerated at a terrifying rate. A denarius from the time of Augustus was nearly pure silver. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, it was about 75% silver. By the time of Septimius Severus, it was down to around 50%. By the 260s, at the height of the crisis, the coin that was still called a denarius or an antoninianus was, in reality, a copper-bronze slug with a microscopic silver wash that would rub off after only a few days in circulation. It was, for all intents and purposes, a worthless token. The consequences of this were catastrophic. The government was essentially perpetrating a massive fraud on its own people, and the people quickly realized it. This led to runaway, uncontrollable hyperinflation. Why accept a worthless coin for your goods today when it will be even more worthless tomorrow? People lost all faith in money. Prices for everyday goods skyrocketed, sometimes doubling or tripling in a matter of months. Surviving receipts from Egypt show the price of a measure of wheat increasing by a factor of 200 over the course of the 3rd century. The complex, interconnected Roman economy ground to a halt. Long-distance trade, which relied on a stable currency, became too risky. The economy began to revert to a more primitive state of barter. Farmers would trade grain for tools. Artisans would trade pottery for food. The state itself, unable to pay its soldiers or bureaucrats in its own worthless currency, began to demand taxes not in coin, but in kind. This was the annona militaris, a crushing levy of grain, wine, oil, leather, weapons, whatever the army needed. This system was brutally inefficient and placed an impossible burden on the provincial population. The curiales, the local city councillors and aristocrats who were personally responsible for collecting taxes in their regions, were systematically ruined. If there was a shortfall, they had to make it up from their own pockets. Many tried to abandon their posts and flee their cities, but imperial decrees made their positions hereditary and inescapable. The very class of provincial leaders who had administered the empire for centuries was being deliberately wiped out by the state's rapacious demands. As if civil war, foreign invasion, and economic collapse were not enough, the empire was also stalked by a third horseman of the apocalypse, plague. Around the year 249, a devastating pandemic, known to history as the Plague of Cyprian after the Bishop of Carthage who described it in vivid detail, erupted across the empire. We don't know for sure what the disease was, perhaps an outbreak of smallpox, influenza, or a filovirus similar to Ebola, but its effects were horrific. Cyprian described victims suffering from constant vomiting, their eyes inflamed, their limbs rotting away, and a raging fever. The plague lasted for nearly 2 decades and, at its height, was said to have killed as many as 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. The demographic consequences were staggering. Perhaps a quarter to a third of the entire population of the Roman Empire perished. This mass death created acute labor shortages in every sector, especially in agriculture and the army. It tore apart the social fabric, breeding an atmosphere of apocalyptic fear and despair. The old pagan gods of Rome seemed powerless to stop the suffering. Why worship Jupiter or Apollo when they so clearly had abandoned their people? This spiritual crisis created a vacuum that would be filled by new faiths, particularly Christianity, which offered a message of hope, community support for the sick, and the promise of a better life after death. The convergence of these 3 crises, invasion, civil war, and plague, pushed the Roman Empire to the absolute brink of disintegration. The central government in Rome, constantly in turmoil, had lost all effective control over its vast territories. The empire, in a desperate act of self-preservation, literally began to break apart. In the west, the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain, ravaged by Germanic raids and neglected by the central government, seceded in 260 AD under a general named Postumus. They formed the Gallic Empire, a fully functioning Roman state in exile. It had its own emperors, its own senate, its own coinage, and its own army. For nearly 15 years, the Gallic Empire successfully defended its borders against the Germanic tribes, providing the security that Rome could no longer offer. Simultaneously, an even more dramatic breakaway state emerged in the east. The vacuum left by Valerian's capture was filled by Odaenathus, the ruler of the desert trading city of Palmyra. Acting as a de facto Roman client, he rallied local forces and successfully drove the Persians out of Syria. After his assassination, his brilliant and ambitious wife, Queen Zenobia, took power. She was not content to merely be a Roman client. Casting herself as a new Cleopatra, she declared her independence from Rome and, in a series of lightning campaigns, conquered Syria, Palestine, and, most critically, Egypt, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. The Palmyrene Empire, at its height, controlled the entire Roman East. For a brief moment, the Roman world was tripartite: the legitimate but beleaguered emperor in Italy, the Gallic Empire in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. The Imperium Sine Fine had fractured into 3 pieces. This was the absolute nadir. The Roman Empire, as a unified political entity, had ceased to exist, and yet it did not die. The end of the story of the crisis of the 3rd century is not one of final collapse, but of a brutal, bloody, and almost miraculous restoration. Just as the system had produced a series of disastrously incompetent emperors, it finally, out of sheer necessity, produced a series of iron-willed military geniuses from the same Illyrian provinces, modern-day Balkans, that had supplied so many of the barracks emperors. These men were tough, ruthless, and fanatically dedicated to the idea of a restored and reunified Rome. The first was Claudius Gothicus, who, in a series of brilliant battles, decisively defeated a massive Gothic invasion in the Balkans, earning his nickname. He died of the plague, but his work was continued by his successor, Aurelian. Aurelian, who reigned for only 5 years from 270 to 275, was one of the most remarkable figures in Roman history. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of energy and military action. First, he drove the Germanic tribes back across the Danube. Then, recognizing the new, dangerous reality of the world, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. He ordered the construction of a massive new set of defensive walls around the city of Rome itself. The Aurelian walls, much of which still stand today, are a stark and permanent monument to the end of the Pax Romana. The heart of the empire was no longer secure. It now had to be fortified. Having secured Italy, Aurelian then turned his attention to the breakaway empires. In 272, he marched east against Zenobia and her Palmyrene Empire. In a swift and brilliant campaign, he defeated her armies, captured Palmyra, and took the queen herself as a prisoner to be paraded in his triumph. Then, without pausing, he turned his army west and marched on the Gallic Empire. In 274, he defeated the Gallic Emperor Tetricus and formally reunited the western provinces with Rome. In less than 5 years, Aurelian had single-handedly pieced the broken empire back together. The Senate, in gratitude, bestowed upon him the official title he had so clearly earned, Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Aurelian, like so many others, was eventually assassinated by his own officials, but his work, and that of his successors, had pulled the empire back from the abyss. The crisis of the 3rd century was over. But the empire that emerged from the crucible was not the same one that had entered it. It was a darker, harder, more desperate world. The easy confidence of the Pax Romana was gone forever, replaced by a grim struggle for survival. The economy was shattered, the currency worthless, the cities diminished, and the population scarred by decades of war, plague, and terror. The emperor was no longer the first citizen among senators, but an absolute godlike monarch, a dominus whose rule was based on military force and a vast, oppressive bureaucracy. The state that was restored was a fragile, militarized shell, held together by the sheer willpower of a few strong men. It had survived the fever, but the patient was forever changed, weakened, and vulnerable. The fundamental problems had not been solved, only postponed, and their resolution would require an even more radical and ultimately transformative series of reforms that would create the world of late antiquity and plant the final seeds of the ultimate divergence between a surviving East and a dying West. The world Aurelian had pieced back together was not the world his ancestors had known. It was a phantom, a ghost haunting the ruins of its own former glory. The borders were restored, the breakaway empires crushed, but the victory was hollow. The peace was the quiet of an exhausted patient after a near-fatal fever, a stillness born not of health, but of profound trauma. The crisis of the 3rd century had inflicted wounds that could not be healed by military victory alone. It had shattered the empire's soul, broken its economy, and forever destroyed the old certainties. The system that had governed the Roman world for 300 years was a corpse, and a new, harder, more ruthless order was waiting to be born from its ashes. The man who would serve as the grim midwife to this new world was, like the restorers before him, a soldier from the iron-hard province of Illyria. He was a man of humble birth, immense talent, and a terrifying, methodical ambition. His name was Diocles, but the world would come to know him as Diocletian. And his reign was not a restoration, it was a revolution from the throne, an act of brutal, desperate, and world-altering political engineering. Diocletian's rise was a masterclass in surviving the deadly political arena of the late 3rd century. Born to a family of former slaves in Dalmatia, he possessed no grand lineage, no inherited wealth. His only assets were his keen mind and his skill with a sword. He joined the army, the only real path to advancement for a man of his station, and began the long, bloody climb through the ranks. He saw emperors rise and fall like autumn leaves. He fought on the Danube and on the Euphrates. He learned that loyalty was a commodity, that power came from the loyalty of the legions, and that survival demanded a combination of strategic genius and absolute ruthlessness. He served under the emperors Probus and Carus, rising to become the commander of the Protectores Domestici, the elite imperial bodyguard. He was in the inner circle of power, close enough to the throne to feel its heat and to see firsthand its lethal instability. The moment of his ascension was pure, cold-blooded action, a scene that perfectly captured the spirit of the age. In 284, the reigning emperor Numerian, son of Carus, was returning from a victorious campaign in Persia, but the emperor was ill, confined to a closed litter, shielded from the view of his army. For weeks, the army marched west, with the generals issuing orders in the emperor's name. A strange smell began to emanate from the imperial carriage. Finally, near Nicomedia in Asia Minor, the suspicious soldiers forced the litter open. Inside, they found the rotting corpse of the emperor. He had been dead for days, murdered in secret. The immediate suspect was the Praetorian prefect, Aper, a man whose name conveniently meant the boar. He had concealed the death in a clumsy bid to secure power for himself. The army, enraged and leaderless, convened a great tribunal on the spot. A council of generals and high-ranking officers gathered, and with one voice, they acclaimed the commander of the household guard, Diocletian, as the new Augustus. Diocletian accepted the purple robes, strode onto a high tribunal before the assembled legions, and swore a solemn oath to the sun god, Sol Invictus, that he was innocent of Numerian's murder. Then, in a stunning act of summary justice, he declared Aper the assassin. Before Aper could even speak in his own defense, Diocletian drew his sword. The blade flashed in the Anatolian sun. With a single powerful thrust, he plunged it into Aper's chest, killing him instantly before the eyes of the entire army. Some sources claim he fulfilled a prophecy that he would become emperor after killing a boar. Whether it was calculated theater or an act of righteous fury, the message was unmistakable. This was not an emperor who would dither, negotiate, or allow conspiracies to fester. This was a man of decisive, violent action. One problem remained. Numerian's brother, Carinus, was still co-emperor in the west. Another civil war was inevitable. The two armies met at the Battle of the Margus River in modern-day Serbia. Carinus's army was the stronger and more experienced, and for a time, it seemed Diocletian's brief reign was over. But then, in a moment of sheer chance that so often defines history, Carinus was struck down and killed by one of his own officers, a man whose wife the emperor had reportedly seduced. The enemy army, suddenly leaderless, melted away. Diocletian was now the sole, undisputed master of the Roman world. But Diocletian knew, with the chilling certainty of a survivor, that being the sole master was a death sentence. The empire was simply too vast, its problems too numerous for one man to manage. A single emperor, rushing to put out a fire on the Rhine, would inevitably learn that a usurper had risen on the Danube or that the Persians were invading Syria. The crisis of the 3rd century had proven this 100 times over in blood. Diocletian's solution was radical, a breathtaking piece of political innovation born of desperation. In 285, less than a year after becoming sole emperor, he did something unprecedented. He voluntarily gave away half of his power. He adopted a fellow Illyrian officer, a brilliant but coarse general named Maximian, as his son and co-emperor, first with the junior rank of Caesar, and then a year later as a full co-equal Augustus. Diocletian would rule the richer, more strategic east from his capital at Nicomedia, while Maximian would rule the troubled west from Mediolanum, modern-day Milan. Rome itself was relegated to a ceremonial backwater, too far from the frontiers where the real work of survival was being done. This was not just a division of labor, it was a theological and ideological reinvention of imperial power. Diocletian took the title Iovius, identifying himself with the supreme, thinking god, Jupiter. Maximian took the title Herculeus, identifying with the hero god Hercules, the tireless physical agent of Jupiter's will on Earth. They were not rivals, they were a divine fraternity, a single imperial will manifested in two bodies. An attack on one was an attack on both. A victory for one was a victory for both. Their coins and statues depicted them as nearly identical, often embracing, to drive home the message of unity and concord. But even this was not enough. The fires were still burning on too many frontiers. So, in 293, Diocletian expanded the system. He and Maximian each adopted a junior emperor, a Caesar, who would serve as their second-in-command and designated heir. Diocletian chose an iron-fisted general named Galerius to be his Caesar in the east, stationing him on the dangerous Danube frontier. Maximian chose a respected officer named Constantius Chlorus, the Pale, to be his Caesar in the west, tasked with retaking Britain from a usurper named Carausius. This was the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. It was a machine designed to solve all the problems of the 3rd century. It solved the problem of scale. 4 emperors, each with their own court, their own army, and their own sphere of influence, could respond to multiple crises simultaneously. It solved the problem of succession. When a senior Augustus died or retired, his Caesar would automatically be elevated, and a new Caesar would be chosen, ensuring a smooth, predictable transfer of power and eliminating the incentive for ambitious generals to rebel. The empire was now a college of emperors, a united front against chaos. They were a pack of wolves, patrolling the 4 corners of a vast, besieged farm, and their response to any threat was immediate and overwhelming. When the Persians invaded again, Galerius, after an initial defeat, rallied his legions and inflicted a crushing blow, capturing the Shah's harem and forcing a humiliating peace treaty that extended Rome's borders in Mesopotamia. When Britain and northern Gaul were in rebellion, Constantius launched a massive naval invasion, smashing the breakaway regime and restoring the provinces to the empire. In Egypt, Diocletian himself mercilessly crushed a revolt in Alexandria, reportedly slaughtering thousands. The Tetrarchy at war was a terrifyingly efficient instrument of power, stamping out fires with relentless, coordinated brutality. To fuel this new, hyper-militarized state, Diocletian unleashed a storm of reforms that fundamentally re-engineered the very fabric of Roman society, turning the entire empire into a rigid, hierarchical, and oppressive logistical support system for the army. His first war was a war on economic chaos. The currency was worthless, hyperinflation rampant. Diocletian attempted a full monetary reform, issuing new, high-purity gold and silver coins. But there was not enough precious metal in the empire to make this new currency widespread, and the old, debased coins continued to circulate, driving the good money into hiding. In a fit of command economy rage, Diocletian, in 301 AD, issued his infamous edict on maximum prices. This was one of the most comprehensive attempts at price control in history. Engraved on massive stone slabs erected in the marketplaces of every major city in the east, the edict set a fixed price for over 1,000 goods and services: a pound of beef, a measure of wheat, a pair of sandals, the daily wage of a stonemason, even the fee for a lawyer. The penalty for violating the edict, for selling or buying above the legal price, was death. The edict was a cataclysmic failure. It was an attempt to command reality, and reality refused to obey. Merchants, unable to sell their goods at the mandated low prices without incurring a loss, simply withdrew them from the market. Widespread shortages ensued. A thriving black market sprung up overnight, operating in the shadows. The law, instead of creating stability, created famine and fear. People were executed for selling a bushel of grain for a few denarii, more than the legal limit. After immense social disruption and bloodshed, the edict was quietly abandoned, a testament to the futility of trying to command economics with a sword. His tax reform, however, was far more successful and far more terrifying in its long-term consequences. To create a predictable and stable source of revenue, Diocletian instituted a new system of taxation, known as the capitatio iugatio. It was a system of breathtaking, brutal simplicity. Imperial census takers, the censors, swarmed across the provinces, creating a comprehensive register of the empire's productive capacity. They counted every caput or head of peasant labor. Men, women, and even children were assessed at various fractions, and every iugum or yoke, a unit of land whose size varied based on its quality. Was it prime vineyard land in Campania or marginal pasture in the hills of Syria? Every olive tree, every head of cattle, every acre was assessed, catalogued, and entered into the imperial ledgers. Each year, the state would calculate its budgetary needs and then declare how much tax was due per caput and per iugum. The tax was primarily levied not in useless coin, but in kind: grain, cloth, wine, oil, leather, and fresh recruits for the army. This system gave the state a predictable budget, but it did so at a terrible cost to human freedom. To ensure the tax base did not shrink, the state enacted laws that chained people to their professions and their land. A farmer, or colonus, was now legally bound to the piece of land he worked. He could not leave. If the land was sold, he was sold with it. His children were required by law to become farmers on that same land. The son of a soldier was required to become a soldier. The son of a baker who baked bread for the army was required to become a baker. Society was frozen into a rigid, hereditary caste system. The sprawling, fluid, market-driven society of the early empire was gone, replaced by an iron cage of hereditary obligation. This was the birth of a world that looks hauntingly like the serfdom of the medieval period, and it was created by the Roman state itself as a desperate measure of self-preservation. The army that this new society was designed to serve was also fundamentally transformed. Diocletian and his colleagues recognized that the old system of stationing all the best legions on the frontiers was too inflexible. He broke the army in two. The frontier forces, the limitanae, were transformed into a kind of hereditary border militia. They were given plots of land to farm and were expected to hold the line, manning the forts and watchtowers and dealing with minor raids. They were second-rate troops, farmer soldiers intended to act as a tripwire. The real power now lay with the comitatenses, vast, mobile field armies that were kept in strategic reserves far from the frontiers. These were the elite, full-time, professional soldiers, the state's rapid reaction force. When a major invasion or usurpation occurred, the emperor would lead the comitatenses on a forced march across the provinces, thundering down on the crisis point with overwhelming force. This new structure provided much-needed strategic flexibility, but it had a dark side. It meant that vast armies were now permanently quartered in the interior of the empire, living off the crushing taxes of the provincials and acting as a constant and visible instrument of the state's oppressive power. The Roman soldier was no longer just a distant guardian on the frontier. He was the fearsome enforcer living in your city. Finally, Diocletian turned his methodical, ordering rage to the one element of Roman life that he could not control: religion. The chaos of the 3rd century had shaken faith in the old gods, and new mystery cults had flourished. The most successful and most problematic was Christianity. To Diocletian and his hardcore traditionalist Caesar, Galerius, Christianity was a cancer on the body politic. It was an organized state within a state that preached allegiance to a higher king than Caesar. Its members refused to perform the traditional sacrifices to the Roman gods and the emperor's divine spirit, a ritual that was seen not just as a religious act, but as a fundamental test of political loyalty. The Christians were exclusive, stubborn, and, in the eyes of the state, atheists for their refusal to recognize the Roman pantheon. Diocletian, having restored the empire's borders, its economy, and its government, believed that one final, brutal act of purification was needed to restore its soul and secure the favor of the gods for his new order. In 303 AD, after years of hesitation, he unleashed the Great Persecution. A series of 4 edicts were promulgated, each more savage than the last. The first ordered the destruction of all churches, the burning of all sacred scriptures, and the banning of Christian worship. The sound of axes splintering church doors and the sight of holy books being thrown onto bonfires in the public square became common. The second edict ordered the arrest of all clergy, bishops, priests, and deacons. The prisons of the empire began to swell with the leaders of the Christian communities. The third edict offered the arrested clergy a choice: perform a sacrifice to the pagan gods and be released, or refuse and face torture. Many broke under the strain, but many more refused, enduring horrific torments. The fourth and final edict, issued in 304, was a universal command. Every single man, woman, and child in the empire was required to gather in public and perform a sacrifice, to pour a libation of wine or burn a pinch of incense to the Roman gods. Certificates of compliance, libelli, were issued to those who obeyed. Those who refused were subject to immediate execution. The persecution was a brutal, empire-wide war on a belief system. The action was horrific. In the east, under the zealous direction of Galerius, the enforcement was particularly savage. Christians were burned alive over slow fires, thrown to wild beasts in the arena, or put to death by a new, gruesome method of execution known as the gridiron. The accounts of the martyrs, whether entirely factual or embellished, speak of a titanic struggle of wills. They tell of believers whose defiance only grew stronger with pain, whose faith provided a shield against the worst the Roman state could inflict. Yet the persecution was not universally enforced. In the West, Diocletian's junior colleague Constantius Chlorus, the father of the future Constantine the Great, largely ignored the edicts. He demolished a few church buildings for show, but he refused to hunt down and execute believers. This disparity revealed a fundamental crack in the unity of the Tetrarchy. The persecution, designed to unify the empire in a shared traditional piety, instead exposed its growing ideological divisions. It failed to break the will of the Christians and instead created a generation of heroes and martyrs that would only strengthen the Church's resolve. After 20 years of relentless revolutionary rule, Diocletian, now old and in failing health, made his final and most astonishing move. On May 1st, 305 AD, he did something no Roman emperor had ever done before. He voluntarily retired. In a grand ceremony held outside his capital of Nicomedia, on the same hill where he had first been proclaimed Augustus, he stood before his legions, stripped off his purple robes, and formally abdicated his power. On the very same day, hundreds of miles away in Milan, his co-emperor Maximian, weeping and reluctant, was forced by Diocletian to do the same. The machine of the Tetrarchy clicked into place. The two Caesars, Constantius and Galerius, were automatically promoted to the rank of Augustus. Two new Caesars were appointed to serve under them. The system had worked. Diocletian, the most powerful man in the world, walked away from it all and retired to his colossal, fortress-like palace on the Dalmatian coast in modern-day Split, Croatia, to spend his final years growing cabbages. When his old colleague Maximian later tried to entice him out of retirement to reclaim power, Diocletian famously wrote back, "If you could only see the cabbages I am growing with my own hands, you would not ask me to sacrifice this peace for the storms of never-satisfied greed." It was the perfect, logical conclusion to his life's work. He had built a system, a machine for ruling, that was supposed to be greater than any single man. He believed he had finally tamed the beast of Roman politics, chained ambition, and secured the empire for a century to come. But in the grand windswept palace at Salona, overlooking the turquoise waters of the Adriatic, a former emperor was tending his garden. Diocletian, the man who had wrestled the Roman world back from the abyss and shackled it in a cage of iron-willed order, now dedicated himself to the quiet cultivation of vegetables. He had built a machine, the Tetrarchy, designed to run without him, a perfect, logical system meant to suppress the very chaos he had spent a lifetime fighting. He had created a clockwork empire, but he had made one fundamental error. He had forgotten that the gears of this machine were not cold metal, but hot-blooded men, driven by the ancient, unquenchable thirsts for glory, for vengeance, and for absolute power. While Diocletian grew his cabbages, the seeds of his system's destruction were already beginning to sprout across the empire, watered by the very ambitions he had sought to eradicate. The first crack in the great edifice appeared, fittingly, in the city of Rome itself. The old capital, demoted and ignored by the tetrarchs, still harbored a deep-seated pride and a dangerous nostalgia. Its citizens were resentful, and so was its Praetorian Guard, the once feared kingmakers who had been rendered largely obsolete. But most resentful of all was a young man named Maxentius. He was the son of Diocletian's own co-emperor, the retired Augustus Maximian, and he had been deliberately passed over in the new succession. He watched as others were elevated to the rank of Caesar, while he, the son of an emperor, was left with nothing. The logic of the Tetrarchy, which valued ability over blood, was an insult to his very existence. In 286 AD, sensing the mood in the city, Maxentius made his move. He conspired with the disgruntled Praetorians, promised them riches and a restoration of their old power, and was proclaimed emperor in the heart of Rome. It was an act of pure, hereditary rebellion. It was a dagger aimed at the very soul of Diocletian's new world. But an even greater tremor was about to shake the system from its far northwestern edge. In the misty, rain-swept garrison town of Iberacum, in the province of Britannia, modern-day York, the Augustus of the West, Constantius Chlorus, lay dying. At his bedside was his son, a young man who, like Maxentius, had been snubbed by the tetrarchic succession. He was tall, imposing, and possessed a restless energy and a palpable aura of destiny. He had spent years as a virtual hostage in Diocletian's eastern court, learning statecraft and warfare while always under the watchful eye of the senior emperors. That young man's name was Constantine. When Constantius finally drew his last breath on July 25th, 306, the carefully laid plans of Diocletian shattered. The legions of Britain had long been loyal to the family of Constantius. They had no allegiance to the distant, designated Caesar in the south. They knew only the man who had fought alongside them, the son of their beloved general. In a spontaneous, thunderous acclamation that echoed from the walls of Iberacum and defied every rule of the new order, the soldiers hoisted Constantine onto their shields, draped the imperial purple over his shoulders, and hailed him as Augustus. The clockwork empire was now in open revolt against its own creator. Diocletian's machine of 4 had fractured into a chaotic scramble of 6 claimants to the purple. In the east, the legitimate Augusti, Galerius and Severus. In the west, the rebels, Maxentius in Rome and Constantine in Britain. And to make matters worse, Maxentius's father, the old emperor Maximian, bored of retirement, burst back onto the political stage, reclaiming his title of Augustus to aid his son. The empire suddenly had a half-dozen men all calling themselves emperor, each with an army, each with a claim, and each viewing the others as a mortal threat. It was the crisis of the 3rd century reborn, a hydra of ambition sprouting new heads faster than they could be severed. What followed was a dizzying 5-year melee of intrigue, betrayal, and civil war. Armies marched and countermarched across Europe. Emperors were made, murdered, and forced into suicide. The legitimate Augustus Severus marched on Rome to crush Maxentius, but his army, once loyal to Maxentius's father, deserted him. He was captured and executed. The senior Augustus Galerius, the true heir of Diocletian's vision, then invaded Italy himself, but he too was outmaneuvered and forced into a humiliating retreat. In a desperate attempt to restore order, Diocletian was coaxed out of his retirement to attend a great conference at Carnuntum on the Danube. But his power was gone. He could only watch as the new strong men carved up the empire between them. He pleaded with his old colleague Maximian to retire once more, but the thirst for power, once tasted, is not easily relinquished. The old Herculeus would continue his plotting until he was finally cornered and forced to commit suicide by his own son-in-law, Constantine. The system was dead. Power no longer came from a logical chart, but from the blade of a sword. Through this whirlwind of chaos, 2 primary figures began to emerge from the wreckage in the west, 2 alpha predators circling each other for the ultimate prize. In Rome, Maxentius consolidated his power, ruling Italy and Africa as a classical, pagan emperor in the old style. He was a builder, a patron of the city, but also a cruel and decadent tyrant. In Gaul, Britain, and Spain, Constantine forged his provinces into an efficient and loyal power base. He was a brilliant general, a master propagandist, and a man who radiated an almost supernatural self-confidence. He spent these years securing his frontiers, fighting dazzling campaigns against the Franks and Alemanni along the Rhine, and building a fearsome, battle-hardened army. He knew a final cataclysmic confrontation was inevitable. The Roman world was not big enough for both of them. In the spring of 312 AD, Constantine made a decision of such audacious, reckless courage that it bordered on madness. He gathered his army, a force of around 40,000 men, and prepared to invade Italy. It was a spectacular gamble. Maxentius controlled the peninsula, and his armies outnumbered Constantine's by at least 2 to 1. He held every fortified city, including the impregnable capital of Rome itself. Constantine was marching into the lion's den. As his army crossed the Alps and descended into the plains of northern Italy, every observer must have believed his campaign was doomed. But Constantine's soldiers were veterans, fiercely loyal to their general, and he moved with the speed and ferocity of a lightning strike. He smashed a Maxentian army at Turin. He crushed another at Verona after a desperate and bloody battle. He was a whirlwind of victory, his momentum building, his legend growing with every defeated enemy. The path to Rome was open, and it was here, on the march towards the final confrontation, that something happened that would change the course of human history. The story, as told by the Christian historian Eusebius, who claimed to have heard it from Constantine himself, is one of the pivotal moments of Western civilization. Constantine, knowing he was outnumbered and facing the fight of his life, was looking for divine aid. As he marched, he and his army looked up at the afternoon sun, and there, emblazoned in the sky above the sun, they saw a cross of light, and with it the Greek words en touto nika, on toutoa nika, in this sign you will conquer. That night, in a dream, Christ appeared to Constantine and commanded him to make a copy of the sign he had seen in the sky and use it as his standard in battle. This was the labarum, a standard consisting of a long spear with a crossbar from which hung a banner of silk surmounted by the chi rho, the intertwined first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Was it a true miracle, a solar halo phenomenon, a brilliantly timed psychological ploy by a general who knew his troops needed to believe they were part of something greater? The answer is lost to the fog of history, but its effect was undeniable. Constantine, whether through sincere conversion or political genius, had just enlisted the God of the Christians onto his side. He was no longer just a general fighting for power, he was a warrior of God on a holy mission. His soldiers, many of whom were already Christian or worshippers of the sun god Sol Invictus, whose symbol was also a cross, were electrified. They painted the strange new symbol on their shields. They were now an army of faith, marching on a pagan tyrant. Maxentius, secure behind the massive Aurelian walls of Rome, could have simply waited. He had a vast stockpile of food, and Constantine had no siege equipment. But Maxentius, swayed by favorable omens and goaded by the taunts of the Roman crowd, made a fatal error. He chose to march out of the city and meet Constantine in open battle. He led his massive army across the Tiber River via the Milvian Bridge, a solid stone bridge, and a hastily constructed parallel bridge of boats. He drew up his forces on the north bank, his back to the river. It was a catastrophic tactical blunder. On October 28, 312, the two armies clashed. The battle was a brutal, head-on collision. Constantine himself was in the thick of the action, a terrifying figure in his gleaming armor, leading his cavalry in a furious charge that smashed into the flank of the Maxentian horsemen. The sight of the strange Chi-Rho symbols on the shields of the advancing enemy, combined with the sheer ferocity of Constantine's veteran troops, seemed to unnerve the larger but less motivated army of Maxentius. His lines began to waver, then they buckled, then they broke completely. A panicked, disorderly retreat turned into a full-blown rout. The entire army scrambled to get back across the river, back to the safety of the city walls. But their escape route was a deadly bottleneck. Thousands were cut down by Constantine's pursuing cavalry. Thousands more, pushed by the crush of bodies, fell from the narrow bridges into the churning waters of the Tiber. The temporary bridge of boats, overloaded with terrified armored men, collapsed under the strain, plunging hundreds into the river, and among them was Maxentius himself. Weighed down by his magnificent armor, he was thrown from his horse into the muddy water and drowned. The Tiber River, the ancient symbol of Rome's lifeblood, became his tomb. The next day, his body was fished out of the river, his head severed and paraded on the end of a spear, as Constantine made his triumphant entry into Rome. He was hailed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He had gambled everything, and he had won. His victory was absolute, and its consequences were immediate and revolutionary. One of his first acts was the issuance in 313 AD of the Edict of Milan, in conjunction with his new co-emperor in the East, Licinius. This was not an edict making Christianity the state religion, but it was something almost as radical. It declared universal religious toleration. It formally ended the Great Persecution. It ordered the return of all confiscated church property. It decreed that Christianity was now a legal, legitimate religion to be treated with respect by the state. The faith that Diocletian had tried to systematically destroy was now under the personal protection of the emperor. In the space of a single battle, the cross had transformed from a symbol of criminal execution into a symbol of imperial victory. Constantine had united the entire Western Roman Empire under his sole command. He was the master of a dominion stretching from the deserts of Africa to the snowy forests of Scotland. He had vanquished his rivals, avenged his father, and begun a religious revolution that would echo through millennia. But his work was not done. The empire was still divided. In the east, his supposed partner, Licinius, watched Constantine's rise with growing fear and jealousy. The two men were now the last great titans in the Roman world, allies of convenience who both knew that the final, inevitable duel was yet to come. The peace was just an intermission. The stage was being set for one last civil war, a final struggle that would not just determine who would be the sole master of the Roman world, but what kind of world it would be, the pagan past or a new Christian future. The victory at the Milvian Bridge was more than a triumph of arms. It was the dawn of a new epoch. The severed head of Maxentius, paraded through the streets of Rome, was a gruesome testament to the end of one age and the violent birth of another. Constantine was now the undisputed master of the West, his authority stretching from the sun-scorched frontiers of Mauritania to the Hadrianic Wall shivering under a northern sky. He had done more than win a civil war. He had harnessed a new and potent spiritual force to the engine of Roman power. The cross, once the emblem of a subversive and persecuted cult, now flew beside the Roman eagle. But the world was not yet his. The empire remained a creature with two heads, a tense and unnatural alliance between two profoundly different men. In the West, there was Constantine, the dynamic, visionary champion of a new faith. And in the East, there was his co-emperor, Licinius, a shrewd, aging, and deeply traditional pagan. The Edict of Milan, their joint declaration of religious tolerance, was less a statement of shared belief than a fragile truce. For a time, it held. The two Augusti, bound by a political marriage, Licinius had married Constantine's half-sister, Constantia, maintained a wary peace. They fought together against foreign invaders, celebrated joint victories, and presented a united front to the world. But beneath the surface of imperial concord, a deep and irreconcilable ideological chasm was widening. Constantine, in the West, began to shower the Christian church with a torrent of imperial favor. He poured state funds into the construction of magnificent new basilicas. He granted bishops the legal authority of magistrates. He made Sunday, the Christian day of worship, a formal day of rest. His court began to fill with Christian advisors, priests, and intellectuals. He was actively and rapidly building the foundations of a Christian Roman state. Licinius, ruling from the east, watched this revolution with growing alarm and suspicion. His half of the empire was the older, richer, and more populous part of the Roman world, and it was still overwhelmingly pagan. Its great cities, Antioch, Alexandria, Ephesus, were home to ancient temples, powerful priestly colleges, and philosophical schools that were the bedrock of classical Hellenic culture. To Licinius and the Eastern elite, Constantine's embrace of Christianity looked like a dangerous form of madness, a betrayal of the very gods who had made Rome great. He began to subtly and then overtly obstruct the implementation of the Edict of Milan in his own territory. He purged Christians from his court and his army, viewing them as a potential fifth column loyal to his Western rival. He forbade bishops from meeting in synods. He harassed Christian communities, imposing restrictions that made a mockery of his supposed commitment to religious freedom. The empire was polarizing. It was becoming a cold war fought between two ideologies, two visions of what it meant to be Roman, with the two emperors as their respective champions. The inevitable clash came in 324 AD. After years of rising tensions and border skirmishes, Constantine declared war. He presented the conflict not as a simple power grab, but as a crusade. He was marching east to liberate the Christians from a pagan tyrant. He assembled a massive army of 120,000 men and a fleet of 200 warships. Licinius, anticipating the attack, mustered an even larger force, some 165,000 strong, and a fleet of over 350 ships. It was to be the final, decisive struggle for the soul of the Roman world, a war on a scale not seen since the great civil wars of the late Republic. The two titans met first at Adrianople, in Thrace. Constantine, a master of psychological warfare and audacious tactics, once again demonstrated his military genius. He feigned a frontal assault while secretly leading a detachment of troops across the river on a difficult, unguarded path, smashing into his enemy's flank. The Licinian army, caught by surprise, was shattered. It was a bloodbath. Tens of thousands were killed. Licinius himself barely escaped, fleeing to the fortress city of Byzantium to regroup. But Constantine's momentum was unstoppable. While he besieged Byzantium by land, his eldest son, Crispus, a brilliant naval commander in his own right, engaged the much larger Licinian fleet at the mouth of the Hellespont. In a stunning naval victory, Crispus used superior tactics to smash the enemy fleet, destroying over 100 ships and securing control of the seas. Licinius's position in Byzantium was now untenable. He abandoned the city and fled into Asia Minor to gather the remnants of his legions for one last stand. The final epic battle took place at Chrysopolis, across the Bosphorus from Byzantium. Constantine, leading his troops under the banner of the Labarum, charged across the field. His army, inspired by a messianic belief in their commander's divine mission, fought with a fanatical zeal. Licinius's forces, demoralized and outmaneuvered, collapsed. The slaughter was immense. Licinius fled once more, but he was cornered and forced to surrender. His wife, Constantine's sister, pleaded for his life. Constantine, in a rare act of public clemency, agreed to spare him, exiling him to the city of Thessalonica, but the clemency was short-lived. A few months later, on suspicion of renewed plotting, Licinius was summarily hanged. The last rival was dead. At the age of 52, after 18 years of relentless, bloody struggle, Constantine was now the sole, undisputed master of the Roman world. He had unified the empire under a single emperor and a single god. The tetrarchy was a forgotten dream, its creators dead or disgraced. A new age had begun, the age of Constantine. His first act as sole ruler was a statement of breathtaking ambition, a declaration that he was not just restoring the old world, but building a new one entirely. He turned his attention to the city he had just conquered, the ancient Greek town of Byzantium. It occupied one of the most strategically perfect locations on Earth, a triangular peninsula commanding the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, controlling the vital trade route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was a fortress, a crossroads, and a port, and it was here, on this spot, that Constantine decided to build his new capital, his new Rome. This was a revolutionary act. To move the capital away from the city of Rome, the ancient pagan heart of the empire, was a radical break with 1,000 years of history. His new city would be different. It would be a Christian capital from its very foundation. He laid out the boundaries of the new city himself, reportedly walking the circuit with a spear in his hand, claiming he was being guided by God. An army of builders, architects, and artisans descended on the site. Palaces, forums, baths, and a massive hippodrome for chariot racing rose from the ground with incredible speed. But at the heart of the city were not temples to Jupiter or Apollo, but magnificent Christian churches, most notably the original Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, and the Church of the Holy Apostles. To adorn his new capital, he stripped the old pagan world of its treasures. Masterpieces of Greek and Roman sculpture, the serpent column from Delphi, statues of the Muses from Mount Helicon were ripped from their ancient sanctuaries and shipped to his new city to decorate its public squares. It was a symbolic act of appropriation, a declaration that the glories of the pagan past now served a Christian future. On May 11, 330 AD, after only 6 years of construction, the new city was formally consecrated. It was dedicated to the Christian God and, in an act of supreme self-confidence, it was named after its founder, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was to be the Nova Roma, the new Rome, the capital of a Christian Roman Empire. With the empire politically and spiritually reunified, Constantine turned his attention to unifying the church itself. His new faith, he discovered, was not a monolithic entity. It was racked by fierce internal debates and doctrinal disputes, none more bitter or divisive than the Arian controversy. A priest from Alexandria named Arius had been teaching that Jesus Christ, the Son, was not co-eternal with God the Father, but was a created being, subordinate to the Father. To his opponents, led by the fiery bishop Athanasius, this was a monstrous heresy that denied the divinity of Christ and struck at the very heart of the Christian faith. The debate raged across the Eastern Empire, causing riots in the streets and splitting congregations. Constantine, a soldier and a statesman, had little patience for the subtleties of theology, but he understood the existential danger of disunity. A divided church could not be the bedrock of a united empire. To solve the crisis, he summoned the first great ecumenical council in the history of the church. In the summer of 325 AD, more than 300 bishops from across the Roman world traveled to the lakeside city of Nicaea, their travel expenses paid by the imperial treasury. Constantine presided over the opening of the council himself, a glittering, intimidating figure seated on a golden throne. He was not there as a theologian, but as the emperor, the divinely appointed guardian of the empire's peace and the church's unity. He urged the bishops to set aside their differences and forge a single, universal creed. After weeks of furious debate, the council overwhelmingly sided against Arius. They formulated the Nicene Creed, a foundational statement of Christian orthodoxy that declared the Son to be homoousios, of the same substance, or consubstantial, with the Father. Arianism was condemned as a heresy. The power of the Roman state was now being used not just to protect the church, but to define its core beliefs. The line between church and state, which had once been a chasm, was now beginning to blur into a complex, intertwined union that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. Constantine's final years were a mixture of spectacular triumphs and dark personal tragedy. In the midst of his grand project of building a Christian empire, his court was rocked by a horrific scandal. For reasons that remain one of history's most impenetrable mysteries, he ordered the summary execution of his own eldest son, the brilliant naval commander Crispus, who had helped him win the empire. Shortly thereafter, he also had his second wife, the Empress Fausta, killed, allegedly by being suffocated in an overheated bath. The ancient sources are cryptic, hinting at accusations of adultery or a palace conspiracy. Whatever the truth, the affair was a brutal reminder that this new Christian emperor was still a Roman autocrat, a man capable of the same terrifying acts of domestic violence that had plagued the pagan Caesars before him. He ruled as sole emperor for 13 years, a period of profound and revolutionary change. He continued his legal and military reforms, stabilizing the currency and reorganizing the army. He fought successful campaigns on the Danube and against the Sassanid Persians. His new city grew into a magnificent metropolis, the undisputed center of the Roman world. He had stopped the empire's freefall, given it a new capital, a new faith, and a new sense of purpose. In the spring of 337 AD, feeling his health begin to fail, he prepared for his death. He traveled to a villa near Nicomedia, the city where Diocletian had begun his great reforms. And it was only here, on his deathbed, that he finally submitted to the rite of baptism, the formal act of initiation into the Christian faith. He was baptized by an Arian bishop, a final irony in a life filled with contradictions. He put aside his imperial purple robes and dressed himself in the pure white garments of a new Christian, and it was in these robes that he died. His body was carried back to his great city, Constantinople, and laid to rest in a massive sarcophagus in the Church of the Holy Apostles, a church he had built to house relics of the 12 apostles. His own tomb was placed in the center, positioning himself as the 13th apostle. It was the final, audacious statement from a man who had not just ruled the Roman Empire, but had fundamentally and permanently altered its destiny. He left behind a world transformed, an empire that was now Roman in name and law, but increasingly Christian in its soul and centered on a new capital in the East. He had given the empire a new lease on life, but in doing so, he had also set the stage for its final great divergence, the ultimate separation of the Greek-speaking Christian East from the Latin-speaking collapsing West. The great sarcophagus of porphyry, a stone the color of dried blood reserved for emperors, was sealed. Constantine, the 13th apostle, the restorer of the world, and the architect of a new Christian age, was dead. He left behind a city bearing his name, a church bound to the state, and an empire that was, for the first time in a generation, whole, at peace, and under the command of a single master. But the master was gone, and the peace he had purchased with a lifetime of bloodshed was as brittle as glass. He had bequeathed his revolutionized empire to his 3 sons, but he had also bequeathed to them the ancient, incurable poison of Roman political life, the serpent of ambition. The world Constantine built was about to be torn apart by his own blood. His heirs were Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. They had been raised as princes, granted the rank of Caesar in their youth, and groomed for power. But they had not inherited their father's genius, only his capacity for suspicion and his appetite for command. The fragile unity of the empire shattered almost immediately. The first act of the new reign was not a smooth transition, but a bloodbath. In the months following their father's death in 337 AD, a terrifying and systematic purge swept through the imperial family in Constantinople. The soldiers of the capital, allegedly in a spontaneous display of loyalty to the sons of the great Constantine, hunted down and butchered their rivals. 2 of Constantine's half-brothers were slaughtered. 7 of his nephews, including the man who had been designated to rule alongside the brothers, were cut down. The massacre was ruthlessly efficient, a chilling echo of the dynastic murders of the Julio-Claudians. Only 2 young boys, the nephews Gallus and Julian, were spared, likely because they were too young and sickly to be considered a threat. It was a brutal clearing of the board, leaving only Constantine's 3 sons to carve up the Roman world between them. They divided the empire like a private inheritance. Constantine II took the westernmost provinces, Britain, Gaul, and Spain. The youngest, Constans, took Italy, Africa, and the central provinces of the Danube. And the middle son, Constantius II, a cold, pious, and deeply paranoid man, took the richest and most challenging prize, the entire East, with its magnificent capital and its permanent grinding war against the Persian Empire. This was not a tetrarchy, a college of rulers working in concert. It was a family of rivals, each with his own army, his own court, and a deep-seated jealousy of the others. The arrangement was doomed from the start. It took less than 3 years for the serpent to strike. In 340 AD, Constantine II, the eldest brother, feeling he had been cheated of his rightful share of the inheritance, launched a surprise invasion of Italy to seize territory from his youngest brother, Constans. But he was reckless and overconfident. He was ambushed by Constanz's advance guard near the city of Aquileia, killed in the skirmish, and his body unceremoniously dumped in a river. His army dissolved, and his territory was absorbed by the victor. The 3-headed empire was now a 2-headed beast. For a decade, an uneasy peace held between the 2 remaining brothers. Constans in the west, a ruler who grew increasingly cruel and corrupt, and Constantius II in the east, who spent those years locked in a series of punishing but inconclusive campaigns against the brilliant Sassanid king, Shapur II. Then, in 350 AD, the West exploded once more. A high-ranking pagan general of German descent named Magnentius, exploiting the army's hatred for the dissolute Constans, staged a coup at a banquet. Constans was forced to flee for his life, but he was hunted down in the foothills of the Pyrenees and killed. Magnentius, a brutal but effective soldier, was proclaimed the new Augustus of the West. This was the ultimate challenge to the Constantinian dynasty. Constantius II, the last surviving son of the great Constantine, now had no choice. He had to abandon his war with Persia, gather his legions, and march west to avenge his murdered brother and reclaim his family's empire. The resulting civil war was one of the most catastrophic in Roman history. The 2 largest armies the Roman world could produce, one from the east and one from the west, collided in 351 AD at the Battle of Mursa Major in the province of Pannonia, modern-day Croatia. It was a butcher's yard on an epic scale. The battle raged all day and into the night, a relentless, grinding slaughter between Roman legionaries who should have been defending the frontiers. Constantius's heavy cavalry eventually shattered Magnentius's flank, leading to a decisive victory, but the cost was staggering. Over 54,000 of the best, most highly trained soldiers in the Roman world lay dead on a single field. It was a wound from which the imperial army would never truly recover. The historian Zosimus would later call the battle a catastrophe that fatally weakened Rome's ability to defend itself against the barbarian threats that were gathering like storm clouds on every border. Constantius II won the war, eventually hunting Magnentius down until the usurper fell on his own sword. But he had won a hollowed-out empire. Its military strength bled away in a pointless family feud. Now the sole ruler of the Roman world, Constantius II found himself in the same impossible position his father and Diocletian had faced. The empire was too vast, its frontiers too long for one man to defend. He was pinned down in the east by the relentless Persians. He needed a deputy in the west to command the legions in Gaul, which were under renewed and savage assault from the Alemanni and the Franks. But who could he trust? The purge of 337 had been terrifyingly effective. His family was all but extinct. Reluctantly, his paranoid gaze fell upon the last surviving male relative he had, his young cousin Julian, one of the two boys who had been spared the massacre years before. Julian had been raised in a gilded cage, kept far from power, and forced to study philosophy and rhetoric. He was a quiet, bookish, and awkward young man, a scholar, not a soldier. To Constantius, he must have seemed the perfect choice. A figurehead with the legitimizing blood of Constantine, but too weak and inexperienced to ever be a threat. In 355 AD, Constantius summoned Julian to his court in Milan, formally adopted him, gave him the title of Caesar, and sent him to command the shattered legions of Gaul. It was one of the greatest miscalculations in Roman history. Constantius had intended to send a lamb to the slaughter. Instead, he had unleashed a lion. Julian, the awkward scholar, revealed himself to be a military prodigy, a natural leader of men who possessed a strategic brilliance and a personal courage that bordered on the divine. He threw himself into his new role with a terrifying energy. He reorganized the army, rebuilt the frontier forts, and led his men from the front, sharing their hardships and earning their fanatical devotion. In 357 AD, near the city of Argentoratum, modern-day Strasbourg, Julian, with a mere 13,000 men, faced a massive confederation of Alemanni warriors numbering over 35,000. In a battle of stunning tactical genius, he used his disciplined Roman infantry to absorb the initial wild charge of the Germanic host, and then used his cavalry to crush their flank, turning the battle into a complete rout. It was a victory so total, so spectacular, that it echoed the great triumphs of Caesar and Scipio Africanus. Julian was no longer a puppet, he was a hero, the savior of Gaul. Back in his eastern palace, Constantius II watched his cousin's meteoric rise with mounting dread. The quiet scholar had become a charismatic warrior prince with a fiercely loyal army at his back. This was the classic Roman nightmare, the very scenario that had fueled a century of civil wars. The breaking point came in 360 AD. Constantius, preparing for a major new offensive against the Persians, sent an order to Julian. He was to dispatch 4 of his best legions, the veterans of his Gallic campaigns, for service on the Eastern Front. The order was a shrewd political move designed to strip Julian of his military power base. But Julian's soldiers, the Gallo-Roman troops who had enlisted to defend their homes, refused to go. They had no desire to fight and die in the deserts of Mesopotamia. They saw the order for what it was, an attempt to weaken their beloved commander. In a scene that was a direct, almost perfect echo of Constantine's own acclamation in York 54 years earlier, the legions mutinied. They marched to Julian's palace in Lutetia, modern-day Paris, surrounded it, and began to chant his name. They lifted him on a shield, and lacking a proper diadem, a soldier placed a heavy infantry neck chain, a torque upon his head as a makeshift crown. They hailed him as Augustus. Julian, whether he had orchestrated the event or was genuinely swept up in it, accepted the title. He sent a series of letters to Constantius, attempting to negotiate a settlement where they might rule as co-emperors. But it was useless. Both men knew the empire could have only one master. Another great civil war, pitting cousin against cousin, was now inevitable. Julian gathered his legions and began the long march east, ready to fight for the ultimate prize. Constantius, abandoning his Persian campaign, marched west to meet the challenger. The two great Roman armies, the forces of the east and the west, were once again on a collision course, destined to bleed each other white on some forgotten battlefield. The empire held its breath. But the final apocalyptic battle never came. As he marched through Asia Minor, Constantius II, the last son of Constantine, was struck down by a sudden, raging fever. He died in a small town in Cilicia, his body consumed by disease before his cousin's sword could reach it. In his final moments, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance, he is said to have done a remarkable thing. He allegedly named his rival, Julian, as his lawful and sole successor. It was his last, desperate act to save the empire from another devastating civil war. And so, in 361 AD, Julian, the scholar, the general, the unexpected Caesar, entered Constantinople not as a renegade, but as the legitimate, undisputed Augustus of the entire Roman Empire. The dynasty of Constantine had come full circle, ending not with the sons, but with the nephew who had survived their bloody purge. The city hailed its new master, a man who seemed to embody the best of the old Roman virtues, a philosopher and a soldier, a man of intellect and action. But Julian carried a secret, a belief he had nurtured in the shadows for years. He believed the new faith of his family, Christianity, was a poison, a Galilean disease that had weakened the empire and brought it to its knees. He was not a new Constantine, he was the anti-Constantine. The Christian revolution was about to face its greatest and most unexpected challenge, a counter-revolution from the throne itself. The city of Constantinople, which had been born as a Christian capital, now welcomed a pagan messiah. Julian, the last male heir of the house of Constantine, entered his cousin's city not as a conqueror, but as the legitimate, undisputed ruler of the Roman world. He was a figure of electric contradiction, a warrior who loved philosophy, a prince who disdained pomp, an emperor who slept on a straw mattress and viewed the elaborate court rituals of his predecessors with open contempt. In the first few months of his reign, a wave of hope swept through the empire. He slashed the bloated palace bureaucracy, firing thousands of parasitic eunuchs, spies, and functionaries. He put the corrupt ministers of Constantius on trial. He lowered taxes. He seemed to many to be the philosopher king that Plato had only dreamed of, a man destined to restore the virtues of a simpler, nobler Rome. But Julian carried a secret fire within him, a belief he had nurtured in the silent libraries and sun-dappled groves of his youth. And now, as the master of the world, he finally unleashed it. He issued a series of edicts that sent a shockwave across the empire. He formally declared himself a worshipper of the old gods. He ordered the immediate reopening of the pagan temples, their doors sealed for a generation. The smoke of sacrifice, the scent of incense and roasting flesh offered to Jupiter, Apollo, and Mithras once again filled the air in the cities of the East. The pagan population, long suppressed and marginalized, erupted in delirious celebration. They hunted down and lynched Christian bishops who had grown rich on the spoils of their old temples. The tables were turning with breathtaking speed. Julian's counter-revolution, however, was not a simple, nostalgic return to the past. It was something far more sophisticated and dangerous. He had studied his enemy. He understood that Christianity had triumphed not just through faith, but through its brilliant organization, its powerful social network of charity, and its intellectual appeal. He resolved to fight fire with fire. He did not, for the most part, order a bloody, empire-wide persecution in the style of Diocletian. His methods were more subtle, more insidious, designed to strangle Christianity by cutting off its sources of power and intellectual life. First, he attacked its wealth and legal authority. He stripped the Christian clergy of the special privileges granted by Constantine, their tax exemptions, their right to use the imperial post system for free travel, their authority to act as judges in civil cases. In a single stroke, he demoted the bishops from powerful state officials back to mere priests of a tolerated but disfavored sect. Next, and most brilliantly, he aimed a dagger at the heart of Christian education. In 362 AD, he issued his infamous school law, It forbade Christians from teaching the great works of classical literature and rhetoric, the poems of Homer, the histories of Herodotus, the philosophy of Plato, the orations of Cicero. His logic was sharp and cruel. How can you teach about the gods and heroes of Olympus if you believe them to be demons? You are hypocrites, taking money to expound on texts whose core values you despise. The law was a masterstroke, designed to create a fatal choice for the Christian intellectual class: either abandon their faith or abandon their profession. It threatened to sever Christianity from the mainstream of elite culture, to relegate it to the status of an uneducated, lower-class superstition, while paganism would reclaim its monopoly on high culture and learning. Then he set about creating something that had never existed before: an organized, empire-wide pagan church. He appointed high priests for each province, tasked with enforcing religious discipline. He wrote theological treatises and sermons himself, urging his pagan priests to live lives of ascetic virtue and charity. He wanted them to establish orphanages, hospitals, and food banks to rival the Christian social safety net. He was attempting to remake paganism in the image of its rival, to create a structured, moral, and intellectually coherent alternative that could compete for the hearts and minds of the Roman people. In a final, audacious act of theological warfare, he ordered the rebuilding of the great Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which the Romans had destroyed 3 centuries earlier. His motive was not love for the Jews, but a calculated desire to publicly refute a prophecy of Jesus Christ, who had foretold that not one stone of the temple would be left upon another. If Julian could rebuild the temple, he could prove the Galilean god a liar. The project began with immense fanfare, but then it came to a sudden and mysterious end. The contemporary sources, both pagan and Christian, speak of a terrifying event. As the workers cleared the foundations, they were driven back by fearful balls of fire that erupted from the earth, burning several of them to death. It was most likely a freak accident, a pocket of natural gas ignited, or a minor earthquake. But in a world charged with religious fervor, it was seen as nothing less than a direct, miraculous intervention by the Christian God. The project was abandoned. It was a stunning propaganda victory for the Christians, who declared that God himself had defended the truth of his son's words against the pagan emperor. Julian's grand project of religious engineering was faltering. He was meeting a stubborn, passive resistance from the Christian populace that infuriated him. His pagan revival was failing to catch fire. The people, it seemed, were apathetic. The sacrifices he offered were poorly attended. He felt that he needed a grand, spectacular success, a victory so overwhelming that it would prove, beyond all doubt, that the old gods were once again smiling on the Roman Empire. He needed a war. His gaze turned east, to Rome's ancient and eternal enemy, the Persian Empire. He would succeed where his Christian cousin Constantius had failed. He would lead the legions to a final, crushing victory, sack the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, and return to his empire as a new Alexander, his authority unassailable, his gods vindicated. In the spring of 363 AD, he launched one of the largest and most ambitious military expeditions in Roman history. He assembled a colossal army of over 65,000 elite troops and a massive river fleet of more than 1,000 ships to carry supplies down the Euphrates River. It was a force designed not just to win a battle, but to annihilate an empire. At first, the campaign was a string of dazzling successes. Julian marched deep into the heart of Mesopotamia, smashing Persian forces, capturing cities, and leaving a trail of fire and destruction in his wake. His army and fleet moved in perfect coordination. He was unstoppable, a whirlwind of martial energy. He brought his army to the very walls of the Persian capital, Ctesiphon, but the city was too heavily fortified to be taken by assault. And it was here, at the pinnacle of his success, that Julian made a single, catastrophic decision. Deceived by Persian spies who promised him a shorter, easier route to a decisive battle inland, and wanting to force his army into a single-minded forward momentum, he gave a fatal order. He commanded his own men to set fire to their entire river fleet. The 1,000 ships that had carried their food, their siege engines, and their path of retreat went up in a pillar of black smoke that darkened the Mesopotamian sky. It was the hubris of a Greek tragic hero, an act of supreme, self-destructive confidence. The promised easy route was a lie. The Persian army had shadowed them, scorching the earth, burning the crops, poisoning the wells. Julian's massive army was now stranded, deep in hostile territory, with no supplies, no path of retreat, and a relentless, merciless enemy hunting them from every direction. The glorious invasion turned into a desperate, agonizing death march. Under the burning desert sun, harassed day and night by swift-moving Persian cavalry and horse archers who would appear, unleash a volley of arrows, and then vanish back into the shimmering heat, the Roman army began to starve. The retreat was a nightmare of thirst, hunger, and constant grinding combat. But even in this hellscape, Julian was magnificent. He was everywhere at once, rallying his men, leading counterattacks, sharing their last rations, his courage a burning torch in the gathering darkness. On June 26, 363, during a particularly savage skirmish, a Persian raiding party launched a surprise attack on the Roman rear guard. Julian, who had been resting in his tent without his heavy body armor, grabbed a shield and rushed headlong into the fray to rally his troops. He was a whirlwind of action, fighting like a common soldier, when suddenly a cavalry spear, thrown from an unseen hand, struck him in the side. It pierced his ribs, sliced through his liver, and lodged deep in his torso. His men carried him back to his tent, bleeding profusely. The surgeons knew at once that the wound was mortal. He lay dying for hours, surrounded by his generals and his philosopher friends. He did not cry out or despair. According to the pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was an eyewitness, he spent his final moments calmly discussing the immortality of the soul. He faced his end not as a terrified mortal, but as a philosopher serenely accepting his fate. But Christian legend tells a different, more powerful story. It claims that as Julian lay dying, he took a handful of the blood gushing from his wound, flung it towards the heavens, and cried out his last, defiant words to the Christian god, "Vicisti Galilei, you have won, Galilean." The story is almost certainly a pious invention, but its truth is deeper than fact. In that moment, the entire pagan restoration died with him. The Roman army, leaderless and trapped, hastily elected a new emperor, a bland Christian officer named Jovian. His first and only significant act was to save the army by signing a disastrous peace treaty with the Persians. He surrendered 5 Roman provinces and a string of key fortress cities, a humiliating price for survival. Julian's great gamble had ended in catastrophe. He had reigned for less than 2 years, a brilliant meteoric flash in the long, dark twilight of the empire. He was the last pagan to sit on the Roman throne, the last man who tried to turn back the tide of history. His death was a definitive turning point. The struggle for the soul of Rome was over. The Galilean had, indeed, won. The empire was now irrevocably Christian. But the victory was bittersweet, for the empire itself, bled white by his ambition and its frontiers weakened by his peace treaty, was now more vulnerable than ever to the true storm that was gathering just beyond its borders, a storm of migrating peoples that would not just challenge the empire but tear it limb from limb. The spear that pierced the side of the Emperor Julian did more than kill a man, it killed a dream. The dream of a revived pagan Rome, of a world ruled by philosopher kings and the old gods of Olympus, evaporated in the dust of the Mesopotamian desert. The army, shattered and leaderless, had bought its survival at the price of a humiliating peace, surrendering vast territories that had been Roman for centuries. The pagan restoration was over. The future was now definitively, irrevocably Christian. But the god who had won this titanic struggle for the soul of the empire had inherited a patient that was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, an empire whose military strength was depleted, whose political will was fractured, and whose frontiers were about to face a challenge more terrifying than any Sassanid king or internal usurper. A great and terrible storm was gathering in the vast, unknown steppes of the east. And it was about to break upon the Roman world with the force of a tidal wave. After the brief and unremarkable reign of Julian's successor, Jovian, the army's high command chose a new emperor, a tough, brutish Pannonian officer named Valentinian. Valentinian was a competent soldier and a devout Christian, but he knew the lessons of the past. The empire was too vast, its crises too numerous for one man, Immediately upon his accession in 364 AD, he did what had now become standard practice. He split the empire. He took the troubled west for himself, establishing his court at Trier, close to the perpetually threatened Rhine frontier. For the east, he appointed his younger brother, Valens, as his co-emperor. It was a fateful choice. Valentinian was a man of iron will, a fearsome and often cruel commander who inspired terror and respect in equal measure. Valens was weaker, more indecisive, and plagued by a deep insecurity that would prove fatal. For a decade, the two brothers managed to hold the line. Valentinian spent his entire reign in a state of constant savage warfare along the Rhine and Danube, beating back wave after wave of raids by the Alemanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatians. He was a master of brutal defensive warfare, a tireless wall against the tide. He rebuilt the frontier forts, punished his own commanders mercilessly for any failure, and struck such terror into the Germanic tribes that his very name became a curse in their camps. In the east, Valens struggled with Persian intrigues and internal religious disputes, but for a time, the empire held. It was a grim, desperate, but stable equilibrium. Then, in the 370s, whispers began to trickle into the Roman world from beyond the frontiers, stories carried by terrified refugees and merchants traveling the Silk Road. They spoke of a new people, a race of warriors unlike any seen before. They were a nation on horseback, men who seemed to be fused with their steeds, who lived, ate, and slept in the saddle. They were short, bow-legged, with flat noses, small eyes, and faces so scarred by ritual cuttings in their infancy that they seemed to lack beards. They were the Huns. They had exploded out of the great grasslands of Central Asia, a nomadic whirlwind of destruction, driven by motives the Romans could not even begin to comprehend. They were not raiding for plunder or territory in the way the Germanic tribes did. They seemed to be an elemental force of nature, a human hurricane that destroyed everything in its path. Their primary weapon was the Hunnic composite bow, a marvel of engineering made of laminated wood, sinew and horn, capable of shooting arrows with lethal force and accuracy at incredible distances, all from the back of a galloping horse. Their tactic was a terrifying symphony of chaos. They would appear as a dark cloud on the horizon, then suddenly charge, unleashing a storm of arrows that blotted out the sun. They would feign retreat, luring their enemies into a disorganized pursuit, then turn in their saddles with perfect coordination and unleash another deadly volley. They never fought in formation, but swirled like a flock of deadly birds, their high-pitched, ululating battle cries unnerving even the most disciplined soldiers. This Hunnic storm first fell upon the peoples living in the plains north of the Black Sea. They smashed the kingdom of the Alans, and then, in 375 AD, they crashed into the vast and powerful empire of the Goths. The Goths were a proud Germanic people who had lived on the edge of the Roman world for generations. They were divided into two main groups, the Tervingi and the Greuthungi. They had their own kings, their own laws, and a complex, semi-settled society. They were a formidable military power in their own right, but against the Huns they stood no chance. The Hunnic cavalry smashed their armies, burned their villages, and slaughtered their people without mercy. The Gothic kingdom, which had stood for centuries, shattered in a single campaign. In the autumn of 376 AD, a terrifying spectacle appeared on the northern bank of the Danube River, the great waterway that marked the border of the Eastern Roman Empire. A vast multitude of people, perhaps as many as 200,000, had gathered. They were the survivors of the Tervingi Goths, led by their chieftain, Fritigern. They were not an invading army, but an entire nation on the run, a desperate mass of men, women, and children, their faces etched with the terror of what they had fled. They stretched for miles along the riverbank, their campfires a sea of flickering lights in the darkness. They were begging, pleading for sanctuary. They sent emissaries across the river to the Roman commanders, offering a deal. They would give the emperor their young men to serve as soldiers in the Roman army, the finest warriors of their generation. In return, all they asked for was to be allowed to cross the Danube, to settle on Roman land as refugees, to be granted food and protection from the Hunnic terror that was hard at their heels. In his capital at Antioch, the Emperor Valens received the request, and he saw not a crisis, but a golden opportunity. His advisors pointed out the immense benefits. An army of new, high-quality recruits, delivered free of charge, would be a massive boost to the Empire's depleted military strength. These Goths could be settled in depopulated areas of Thrace, farming the land, paying taxes, and acting as a buffer against future incursions. It seemed like a perfect solution. Valens agreed. He gave the order. The Tervingi Goths were to be granted asylum. They were to be ferried across the Danube, disarmed, and provided with food until they could be settled and bring in their first harvest. The crossing itself was a monumental undertaking, an epic of human desperation. For days and nights on end, the Romans used every boat, raft, and hollowed-out log they could find to ferry the terrified masses across the wide, swirling river. The Roman officials, tasked with managing the process, were quickly overwhelmed. It was impossible to keep an accurate count, impossible to properly disarm such a vast and chaotic multitude. Many Goths, terrified of being left defenseless in a strange land, bribed the Roman officials with whatever they had: a gold coin, a silver brooch, even their own children sold into slavery, to be allowed to keep their swords and spears. And then the Roman plan collapsed into a nightmare of corruption and incompetence. The local Roman officials, Lupicinus and Maximus, were men of breathtaking greed and cruelty. They saw the starving Gothic refugees not as a people to be helped, but as a resource to be exploited. They were supposed to provide the Goths with food. Instead, they hoarded the state-supplied grain and sold it back to the desperate Goths at grotesquely inflated prices. They traded dog meat, which Roman law considered unclean, for Gothic children, whom they sold as slaves. The Goths, who had crossed the river seeking salvation, found themselves in a concentration camp, starving, humiliated, and systematically abused by the very people who had promised them protection. The breaking point came at a banquet. The Roman general Lupicinus, in a move of stunning arrogance, invited the Gothic chieftain Fritigern and his personal retinue to a feast in the city of Marcianople. It was a trap. While Fritigern dined inside, Roman soldiers surrounded and began to butcher his Gothic bodyguards who were waiting outside the walls. Hearing the screams of his men, Fritigern drew his sword, fought his way out of the banquet hall, and galloped back to his people, his heart burning with a righteous fury. The die was cast. The Goths, who had come as refugees, now rose up as an army of vengeance. They exploded out of their camps, a starving, enraged horde. They fell upon the local Roman garrisons and annihilated them. They armed themselves with the superior weapons of the dead Roman soldiers. They were soon joined by other groups, including the Grotthungi Goths who had crossed the Danube without permission, and even by Roman miners and slaves who saw a chance to escape their own brutal oppression. The Balkans erupted in a firestorm of rebellion. The Goths were no longer a disorganized mob. They were a mobile nation of warriors, ravaging the countryside, burning villas, sacking towns, and slaughtering every Roman they could find. They were a cancer that Valens had deliberately injected into the heart of his own empire, and it was now metastasizing out of control. For 2 years, the war raged across the Roman provinces of Thrace. The Romans, with their disciplined legions, would win the set-piece battles, but the Goths, with their superior numbers and their mastery of guerrilla warfare, would melt back into the hills, only to reappear somewhere else, leaving a trail of devastation. The Emperor Valens, his reputation in tatters, finally realized he had to crush the rebellion himself. In the summer of 378 AD, he assembled a massive imperial field army and marched north from Constantinople. He was impatient, proud, and desperate for a decisive victory to restore his honor. Meanwhile, his nephew, Gratian, the son of the great Valentinian who had recently died, was marching from the west with his own veteran army to help. He sent messages to Valens, pleading with him to wait. "Do not rush into battle," he urged. "Wait for my legions. Together we will surround them and annihilate them." But Valens was stung by pride. He was jealous of his young nephew's military reputation, and he wanted the glory of victory for himself. His scouts reported that the main Gothic force, encamped near the city of Adrianople, numbered only around 10,000 men. It seemed an easy victory was at hand. He ignored Gratian's pleas. He would attack at once. It was a fatal miscalculation based on fatally flawed intelligence. On the sweltering hot morning of August 9th, 378, Valens marched his army of some 15,000 men out of Adrianople. He force-marched them for 8 miles under the blazing sun, in full armor, with no food or water. When they finally arrived at the Gothic camp late in the afternoon, his soldiers were already exhausted, dehydrated, and choking on the dust kicked up by their own march and the smoke from the grass fires the Goths had deliberately set. They found the Goths had formed a wagenburg, a defensive circle of their heavy wagons, from behind which their families and warriors could fight. Valens, still believing he faced only a small part of the Gothic army, launched a premature and disorganized attack. The battle began as a chaotic mess. As the Roman infantry struggled to advance against the wagon fort, something terrible happened. Over the crest of a nearby hill, a vast cloud of dust appeared. It was the main Gothic cavalry force, led by the Greuthungi, who had been away foraging. They had returned at the perfect moment. They let out a thunderous roar and crashed into the Roman left flank like a thunderbolt which strikes upon a mountaintop, as the historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote. The Roman cavalry on that flank, caught completely by surprise, was instantly shattered and driven from the field. The Gothic horsemen then wheeled around and smashed into the exposed rear of the Roman infantry. The Roman legions, now completely surrounded, packed so tightly together that they could barely raise their arms to swing their swords, were trapped in a killing box. The battle turned into a massacre. The Goths, fueled by 2 years of hate and humiliation, pressed in from all sides, slaughtering the exhausted and terrified Romans. It was a scene from hell. The sun was obscured by clouds of dust and arrows. The ground became a slick red mud of blood and viscera. The Roman lines dissolved into pockets of desperate men fighting back to back until they were overwhelmed. And in the heart of this cauldron was the Emperor Valens himself. Unhorsed and abandoned by his bodyguards, he was last seen fighting on foot among his elite palace troops. His end is uncertain. One story claims he was struck by an arrow and died on the field, his body buried under a mountain of corpses, never to be identified. Another, more gruesome tale reports that he was badly wounded and carried by his men to a nearby farmhouse. The Goths, unaware the emperor was inside, surrounded the house and, unable to break in, set it on fire, burning everyone inside alive. Whatever his fate, the result was the same. The Emperor of the East was dead. 2/3 of his entire army, some 10,000 elite soldiers, including 35 of his highest-ranking commanders, were annihilated. It was the single worst Roman military defeat since the Battle of Cannae against Hannibal 600 years earlier. But this was worse. At Cannae, Rome was a young, resilient republic that could absorb the blow. Now it was an old, brittle empire whose military manpower was already stretched to the breaking point. Adrianople was more than a defeat. It was a catastrophe from which the Western Roman Empire would never recover. An emperor was dead, an entire army was gone, and a victorious, hostile, and now permanently indigestible barbarian nation was encamped deep inside its borders, free to roam and plunder at will. The gates of the empire had not just been breached, they had been kicked down from the inside. And through those broken gates, a new, darker age was beginning to dawn. The smoke that rose from the burning farmhouse at Adrianople was a funeral pyre for an entire world. The news of the disaster spread through the empire like a plague, carried by the few blood-spattered survivors who staggered out of the killing fields. An emperor was dead. A Roman field army, the East's entire strategic reserve, was not just defeated, but annihilated. The shield of the empire was shattered, and the Goths, now an unopposed and victorious nation of warriors, were masters of the Balkans, free to burn, rape, and pillage their way to the very walls of Constantinople. The psychological shock was profound. For centuries, the Romans had cultivated a myth of their own invincibility. Now, on their own soil, they had been utterly crushed by a people they considered to be savage, undisciplined barbarians. The old terror of the north, the fear of the wild hordes that had haunted the Roman imagination since the days of Marius, was now a terrifying reality, living and breathing inside the empire's broken gates. The surviving emperor, the young Gratian in the West, was in a state of panic. He was now, technically, the ruler of the entire Roman world, but it was a world on fire. He was a capable general, but he could not be everywhere at once. The western frontiers were still simmering, and now the entire eastern half of the empire was defenseless. He desperately needed a new colleague in the east, a man of iron will and supreme military talent who could somehow salvage the unsalvageable. His choice fell upon a brilliant Spanish general named Theodosius, the son of a famous commander who had been unjustly executed years earlier in a spasm of court intrigue. In 379 AD, Gratian elevated Theodosius to the rank of Augustus and handed him the poisoned chalice, command of the Eastern Roman Empire. Theodosius was arguably the last truly great emperor to rule in the Roman tradition. He was a master strategist, a ruthless politician, and a devout Nicene Christian. He arrived in an East that was in a state of total collapse. There was no army to command. The survivors of Adrianople were a broken rabble. His first, agonizing years were not spent fighting glorious set-piece battles, but waging a grim, thankless war of attrition. He was a scavenger, painstakingly rebuilding his army piece by piece. He recruited from the cities, conscripted from the farms, and, most controversially, he began to hire barbarian mercenaries on an unprecedented scale. He paid Huns to fight Goths, Alans to fight Huns. It was a dangerous game, using one barbarian wolf to guard the sheepfold from another, but he had no other choice. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to stabilize the situation, confining the Goths to a smaller territory and preventing them from taking any major fortified cities. But he knew he could not win. He could not destroy the Goths. Adrianople had proven that. There were simply too many of them, and the empire no longer had the manpower to annihilate them. He was forced to do the unthinkable. In 382 AD, after 4 years of grinding, inconclusive warfare, Theodosius signed a treaty, a foedus, with the Goths. It was a revolutionary and desperate act that would change the nature of the empire forever. The treaty allowed the Goths to settle permanently inside Roman territory, in the province of Thrace. But they were not to be disarmed, dispersed, or made to follow Roman law. They were allowed to settle as an autonomous, semi-independent nation within the Roman state. They would be governed by their own chieftains, live under their own laws, and were not required to pay taxes. In return, they were designated as foederati, or allies, and were obligated to fight for the Roman Empire as a single, national contingent under the command of their own leaders. This was a radical break from all previous Roman policy. Before, barbarians who settled in the empire were expected to become Romans. They were broken up, assimilated, and absorbed into the great imperial machine. Theodosius's treaty acknowledged a terrifying new reality. The machine was broken. The empire was now forced to accommodate a barbarian state within its own heartland, a permanent, indigestible foreign body lodged in its guts. The long-term consequences were catastrophic. It created a precedent. Other barbarian tribes, seeing the success of the Goths, would now demand the same treatment. More importantly, it fatally compromised the integrity of the Roman army. The army was now increasingly composed of non-Romans, of barbarian contingents with a primary loyalty not to the emperor or the abstract idea of Rome, but to their own tribal chieftains who paid them and led them into battle. The Roman army was being hollowed out from the inside, replaced by a collection of barbarian warbands wearing Roman uniforms. While Theodosius struggled with the Gothic problem, the West was once again descending into its own familiar cycle of usurpation and civil war. Gratian was assassinated in 383 by a rebel general in Britain named Magnus Maximus. Theodosius, after a period of tense coexistence, eventually marched west and crushed the usurper, briefly reuniting the empire. But upon his return to the east, the west fell apart again. His puppet emperor was murdered by his own Frankish general, a powerful and ambitious man named Arbogast. Arbogast, being a barbarian, knew he could never be accepted as emperor himself, so he placed a pagan Roman aristocrat named Eugenius on the throne as his figurehead. This new regime in the west launched a final, defiant pagan revival, hoping to rally support against the devoutly Christian Theodosius. In 394 AD, for the last time in history, a united army of the Eastern Roman Empire marched west to fight a united army of the Western Roman Empire. The two forces met at the Battle of the Frigidus River in the Julian Alps. The battle was a 2-day epic freighted with religious significance. Eugenius's army fought under the banner of Hercules, their pagan soldiers inspired by a belief that they were fighting to restore the old gods. Theodosius's army, which included a massive contingent of some 20,000 Gothic foederati, fought under Constantine's Labarum. On the first day, the Goths were sent in to bear the brunt of the fighting and were horribly mauled, suffering immense casualties. But on the second day, a miraculous event occurred. A furious alpine wind, the Bora, began to blow directly into the faces of the pagan army, blinding them with dust and turning their own arrows and spears back upon them. Theodosius's men, seeing this as a sign of divine intervention, charged with renewed fury and completely shattered the enemy lines. Eugenius was captured and beheaded. Arbogast fell on his own sword. Theodosius was, once again, the sole master of the Roman world. As his final act, he banned the practice of paganism entirely, closing the last temples and extinguishing the sacred fire of the Vestal Virgins in Rome, which had burned for over 1,000 years. He had won. He had crushed every rival, settled the Gothic question, and established Nicene Christianity as the one and only religion of the state. He stood at the absolute pinnacle of power, but the victory was a mirage. The empire was bankrupt, its armies were filled with unreliable barbarians, and the catastrophic losses of his Gothic allies at the Frigidus had created deep resentment among their leaders. Just 4 months after his great victory, in January 395 AD, Theodosius died of disease in Milan. He was the last man to rule over a unified Roman Empire. On his deathbed, he made one final, fateful division. He split the empire between his 2 young and hopelessly incompetent sons. The elder, Arcadius, a weak and reclusive 18-year-old, was given the east. The younger, Honorius, a child of 10, was given the west. This time, the split was permanent. The 2 halves would never again be reunited. They would drift apart, becoming 2 different civilizations with 2 different destinies. The East, with its great cities, its vibrant economy, and its defensible capital at Constantinople, would survive and morph into the Byzantine Empire, lasting for another 1,000 years. The West, impoverished, depopulated, and now governed by a child, was left to face the coming storm alone. The storm broke almost immediately. The Gothic foederati, who had been settled in the Balkans, felt cheated. They had sacrificed thousands of their best men for Theodosius at the Frigidus, and they had received little in return. In the power vacuum following Theodosius's death, a charismatic and brilliant new leader rose among them. His name was Alaric. He united the Gothic tribes, was hailed as their king, and he had a burning ambition to carve out a secure, permanent, and wealthy homeland for his people, and to be recognized as a great commander in the Roman system. To get what he wanted, he unleashed his army on the Roman world. For years, he rampaged through the Balkans, sacking cities in Greece, including Athens, before turning his attention to the ultimate prize, Italy. The Western Roman Empire, under the child emperor Honorius, was protected by a single, towering figure, a Vandal general named Stilicho. Stilicho was the Magister Militum, the master of soldiers, and the de facto ruler of the West. He was a brilliant military commander and a shrewd diplomat, and for over a decade, he played a masterful game of chess against Alaric, fending off his invasions of Italy in a series of hard-fought victories. But Stilicho was a Vandal, a barbarian, and he was surrounded by jealous Roman courtiers who whispered poison into the ear of the weak-willed emperor. They accused him of plotting with Alaric, of secretly aspiring to the throne for his own son. In 408 AD, Honorius, in a fit of paranoid stupidity, listened to them. He had Stilicho, the one man who could save the Western Empire, arrested and executed. The murder of Stilicho was an act of terminal insanity. It was the West plunging a knife into its own heart. With Stilicho gone, the Roman army in Italy fell apart. The court then unleashed a brutal pogrom against the families of the barbarian soldiers serving in the army, slaughtering thousands of innocent women and children. The soldiers, enraged, deserted the Roman army in droves and flocked to Alaric's banner. Italy was now completely defenseless. Alaric marched his Gothic army down the peninsula and stood before the walls of Rome. The Eternal City had not faced a foreign enemy at its gates for 800 years. The citizens, terrified but proud, refused his demands. Alaric blockaded the city, cutting off its food supply from the Tiber. Starvation and disease began to ravage the population. The Roman Senate, in desperation, sent emissaries to negotiate. "What are your terms?" they asked. Alaric's reply was chilling. "All your gold, all your silver, all of your movable property, and all of your barbarian slaves." The emissaries were aghast. "But what will that leave us?" they asked. Alaric, a man with a dark sense of humor, reportedly laughed and said, "Your lives." He eventually settled for a lesser but still monumental ransom. He lifted the siege and retreated. But the feckless imperial court, safe in its marsh-bound fortress capital of Ravenna, refused to ratify any meaningful treaty. Alaric, his patience finally exhausted, marched on Rome for a third time in August of 410 AD. This time, there was no long siege. A slave, either out of treachery or a desire to end the suffering, opened the Salarian gate in the dead of night. For the first time since the Gauls had done it in 390 BC, the city of Rome was in the hands of a foreign army. For 3 days, Alaric's Goths sacked the city. They were Christians, so they largely spared the great churches where the population had taken refuge. But they plundered the palaces of the senators, stole centuries of accumulated wealth, and burned entire sections of the city. The psychological impact of the event was earth-shattering. The city that had conquered the world, the symbol of order and permanence, the Caput Mundi, had been violated and humbled. To people across the Mediterranean, it seemed as if the world itself was coming to an end. Saint Jerome, hearing the news in his monastery in Bethlehem, wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The lamp of the world has been extinguished." Alaric did not stay. He led his people south, intending to cross to Africa, but he died of a fever before he could. The Goths eventually migrated to Gaul and Spain, where they established the Visigothic kingdom. But the spell of Rome's invincibility was broken forever. The sack of 410 was a mortal wound, and it was followed by another, even more devastating blow. On the last day of the year, 406 AD, while Stilicho was busy fighting Alaric in Italy, the Rhine frontier, left dangerously undermanned, froze solid. A vast wave of barbarian peoples, Vandals, Suebi, and Alans, poured across the frozen river into the defenseless provinces of Gaul. It was not a raid, it was a mass migration. They swarmed through Gaul like a plague of locusts, looting and burning before crossing the Pyrenees and settling in Spain. The Western Empire had lost control of Gaul and Spain forever. And one of these groups, the Vandals, under a king of terrifying cunning and ambition named Gaiseric, would soon look across the Straits of Gibraltar to Rome's last and most vital possession, the rich provinces of North Africa, the breadbasket that fed the city of Rome itself. The final fatal pieces were falling into place. The West was not just dying, it was being systematically dismembered. The news of Rome's fall in 410 echoed in a world that suddenly seemed unmoored from reality. It was a psychic wound far deeper than the physical destruction. The Eternal City, the sacred heart of order and civilization, had been violated. But the Western Roman Empire, though mortally wounded, was not yet dead. It entered the 5th century, a ghost of its former self, a hollowed-out political fiction clinging desperately to life. It was a state in name only, its provinces lost, its armies composed of barbarian mercenaries, and its authority confined to the Italian peninsula and a few scattered territories. The story of its final decades is not a grand tragedy, but a grim, pathetic spectacle of entropy, a slow, agonizing slide into the abyss, punctuated by the reigns of shadow emperors and the ambitions of the barbarian warlords who were the true masters of the age. The dominant figure to emerge from the wreckage of the early 5th century was a Roman general named Flavius Aetius. He was a man perfectly suited to his dark and treacherous times, a brilliant diplomat, a master strategist, and a ruthless political survivor. He had spent his youth as a hostage, living among both the Goths and the Huns, and he understood the barbarian world better than any Roman alive. For nearly 2 decades, from the 430s to the 450s, Aetius was the de facto ruler of the West, the last effective Roman general, the last of the Romans. He did not command a mighty imperial army, but masterfully played the various barbarian tribes against each other. He used Hunnic mercenaries to crush the Burgundians in Gaul. He used Visigothic foederati to fight the Vandals in Spain. He was a master puppeteer, holding the crumbling edifice of the Western Empire together through sheer force of will and political genius. His greatest challenge and his finest hour came from the one power that could threaten to extinguish Roman and barbarian alike. The Huns, the terrifying whirlwind that had first set this great migration in motion half a century earlier, had now coalesced under a single, terrifying leader. His name was Attila. He was not a king, but a force of nature, a man who called himself the Scourge of God. He had forged the Hunnic tribes and the peoples they had conquered into a vast, nomadic empire of destruction centered in the plains of Hungary. In 451 AD, Attila, at the head of a colossal army of Huns, Ostrogoths, and other subject peoples, crossed the Rhine and plunged into the heart of Gaul, leaving a trail of sacked cities and slaughtered populations in his wake. He was marching on the city of Orleans when Aetius, performing a final, desperate miracle of diplomacy, assembled a coalition army to stop him. It was a testament to the strange, hybrid world of the 5th century. Aetius's army was composed of his few remaining Roman troops, alongside a massive contingent of their old enemies, the Visigoths, led by their aging king, Theodoric I. The two vast armies, a great confederation of civilizations against a great confederation of destroyers, met on a vast plain in Gaul known as the Catalaunian Fields. The resulting battle was a chaotic, swirling vortex of violence on an almost unimaginable scale, a clash of nations that raged all day. It was a desperate, brutal slugging match. The Visigothic king, Theodoric, was killed, falling from his horse and being trampled to death in the fray. But his son, Thorismund, enraged by his father's death, led the Visigoths in a furious counterattack that broke the Hunnic lines. Attila himself was nearly captured, forced to retreat to his camp of wagons, where he reportedly built a funeral pyre of saddles ready to throw himself into the flames rather than be taken alive. The battle was technically a draw, a bloodbath so immense that both sides were too shattered to continue. But it was a strategic victory for Aetius. He had stopped the unstoppable. Attila's aura of invincibility was broken, and he retreated back across the Rhine. Aetius had saved Western civilization from the Hunnic tide. The next year, Attila, seeking revenge, invaded Italy itself, sacking cities and driving refugees into the lagoons of the Adriatic, where they would found the future city of Venice. He was marching on Rome when, according to legend, he was met on a riverbank by an embassy led by the charismatic Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo I. The Pope, a figure of immense moral authority, somehow persuaded the Hunnic king to turn back. Whether it was Leo's eloquence, the promise of a massive tribute, or the fact that Attila's army was riddled with plague and low on supplies, the result was the same. Attila spared Rome and retreated from Italy. A year later, in 453, he was dead, reportedly choking to death on his own blood after a drunken feast to celebrate a new marriage. With his death, his vast, chaotic empire of terror instantly fell apart. The Huns vanished from history as quickly as they had appeared. Aetius, the savior of the West, should have been showered with honors. Instead, he met the fate of so many great Romans before him. The pathetic and jealous emperor, Valentinian III, who had spent his life cowering in Aetius's shadow, grew convinced that the general was plotting against him. In 454, during a meeting in the imperial palace at Ravenna, Valentinian, in a fit of rage, personally drew his sword and, with the help of his eunuch chamberlain, hacked Aetius to death. It was the final, fatal act of imperial stupidity. A courtier famously remarked to the emperor, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." 6 months later, Valentinian III was himself assassinated by 2 of Aetius's loyal soldiers, who stabbed him to death in the middle of a military review. The last male descendant of the great Theodosius was dead. The Western Empire no longer had a legitimate dynasty, a competent general, or any hope. The final 20 years of the Western Roman Empire were a gruesome farce, a parade of ephemeral puppet emperors put on the throne and then swiftly murdered by the true power in Italy, the barbarian magister militum. The most powerful of these kingmakers was a Swabian general named Ricimer. For 16 years, he was the shadow ruler of Italy, appointing and deposing a series of 4 helpless emperors with names like Majorian, Libius Severus, and Olybrius. These men were phantoms, their authority not extending beyond the borders of Italy. Ricimer was the true emperor in all but name, but his barbarian heritage meant he could never wear the purple himself. In the midst of this political chaos, the final economic blow fell. In 455 AD, the Vandal king Gaiseric, the cunning ruler who had led his people from Spain into North Africa and conquered the province, sailed his fleet across the Mediterranean and landed at the mouth of the Tiber. The Vandals were Arians, and they bore a deep hatred for the Orthodox Catholics of Rome. The city, now without a real army or a leader, was defenseless. Once again, Pope Leo I went out to meet the invader, pleading for mercy. Gaiseric agreed not to burn the city or massacre the population. In return, the gates were opened to him. For 2 full weeks, the Vandals subjected Rome to a systematic and professional sack that was far more destructive than Alaric's had been. They stripped the temples and palaces of everything of value, even peeling the gilded bronze tiles from the roof of the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. They carried off untold treasures and thousands of captives, including the widow of the late emperor. The Vandal sack of 455 was the final nail in the coffin. It snuffed out the last embers of economic life in the old capital and solidified the loss of Africa, the empire's last wealthy province. The Western Roman Empire was now little more than Italy. The end, when it came, was not a bang, but a quiet, almost bureaucratic whimper. The last in the line of pathetic puppet emperors was a young boy, put on the throne in 475 by his father, a Roman general named Orestes. In a stroke of cosmic irony, the boy was given the grandest name in Roman history, Romulus Augustulus, a diminutive fusion of the founder of the city and the founder of the empire. He was a powerless child, a symbol of a state that had become a parody of itself. The real power in Italy lay with the barbarian mercenary army, a motley collection of Heruli, Siri, and other Germanic tribes who had been defending the peninsula. For years, these troops had been demanding land, asking for 1/3 of the agricultural estates in Italy to be given to them as a permanent settlement, just as their cousins, the Goths and Franks, had received in Gaul. Orestes, in a final foolish gesture of Roman pride, refused. The army mutinied. They acclaimed their own leader, a towering Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, as their king. Odoacer marched on Ravenna, captured it, and executed Orestes. He then walked into the imperial palace, approached the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, and on September 4th, 476 AD, he deposed him. There was no bloodshed, no great battle. Odoacer, seeing the boy was no threat, simply pensioned him off, sending him into a comfortable retirement at a villa near Naples. And then Odoacer did something revolutionary. He did not appoint a new puppet emperor. He recognized the absurdity of the situation. He gathered the imperial insignia of the West, the diadem, the purple robes, the scepter, and sent them in a formal delegation to Zeno, the emperor of the East in Constantinople. The message was clear and simple. There was no longer a need for a separate emperor in the West. Odoacer would rule Italy himself, not as a Roman emperor, but as a king, theoretically under the authority of the one true emperor in Constantinople. Zeno had little choice but to accept this reality. He granted Odoacer the title of patrician, formally recognizing his rule over Italy. And with that quiet diplomatic exchange, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. There was no final cataclysmic battle. No barbarian horde burned Rome to the ground as the last emperor fought to the death. The empire didn't fall, it simply evaporated. It was a slow, systemic failure over the course of more than a century, a complex process of military overstretch, political instability, economic decay, and relentless barbarian pressure. In the end, it was a hollowed-out shell, its provinces lost, its armies barbarianized, its economy in ruins. The final fall was merely a powerful barbarian general deciding to stop pretending that the phantom emperor he served had any real authority. He swept away the last trapping of an institution that had, in every meaningful way, already died. The lamp of the world, as St. Jerome had written, was finally extinguished, and the long, uncertain twilight of a new age, the age we would come to call the Middle Ages, had begun. And so, the story ends. Not with the thunder of a final cataclysmic battle, but with the quiet scratching of a pen on parchment, a courier's long journey east, and a boy emperor sent into a comfortable, forgotten retirement. The Western Roman Empire was over, 476 AD, a date we carve into the timelines, a stark line drawn between one world and the next. But the truth, as always, is a far more complex and haunting thing. We call it a fall, but the word is too simple, too clean. It implies a sudden, violent impact. What happened was not a fall so much as a long, slow dissolution, a metamorphosis. For the farmer in his field in Gaul, or the merchant in his shop in Spain, life did not change overnight. The sun still rose, the seasons still turned, but the invisible structures that had held his world together for 500 years, the single army, the single law, the safety of the roads, the promise of a universal order, had crumbled away, like a great mountain eroding into sand, one grain at a time. The empire died, but it did not vanish. It left ghosts behind, echoes that still shape our world in ways we rarely comprehend. Its language, the Latin of the legions and the law courts, dissolved and was reborn as French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, its vocabulary forming the very bedrock of our own. Its law, the intricate codes of property, contract, and justice, became the foundation upon which Western legal thought was built. Its engineering, the great roads and aqueducts, still trace the path of our modern highways, their arches still supporting our bridges. And its greatest heir, the institution that had grown within it like a child in the womb, the Christian Church, outlived its parent. It became the vessel that would carry the flickering candle of literacy, law, and classical thought through the long, dark centuries that followed, preserving the memory of the world it had inherited. But perhaps Rome's most enduring legacy is the idea of Rome itself, the dream of a single, unified, peaceful civilization, a universal state. It is a dream that would haunt the rulers of Europe for 1,000 years, inspiring Charlemagne, the Holy Roman emperors, Napoleon, and nations yet to come. The ghost of the deceased Roman Empire, as one philosopher wrote, sat crowned upon its grave. The ruins we see today are not just tourist attractions, they are a warning. They are a testament to the fact that nothing is permanent, that even the mightiest and most eternal-seeming structures are fragile things, subject to the slow pressures of climate, disease, economic decay, and the endless, relentless movement of peoples. They remind us that history is not a story of simple lines, but a complex, chaotic, and often tragic process, a process that is never truly over. And now our journey is at an end. We return you to your time and your place, perhaps with the quiet understanding that the foundations of our own world rest on the dust of worlds that have passed before.